Do online and distance education work? Hi, I'm David Baume, a fellow of the Centre for Online and Distance Education. There are 3 Padlets associated with this presentation. Please do respond to them during the presentation or afterwards in the discussion. We'll share the responses. Also, the results will help us with our study into do online and distance education work. If you have to choose between listening to me talk and responding to the Padlets, please respond to the Padlets. You may find it useful to move backwards and forwards between the 3 Padlets rather than completing one and then moving on to 2 and 3. Responses to one of them may suggest responses to others. Padlet 1 asks you, what would show that online and distance education work? Number 2, what would you like to know about how well and how online and distance education work? And number 3, things that you know and crucially can show about what makes online and distance education work. So, do online and distance education work? Some closely related questions immediately spring to mind. They include, what do we mean by work? And given the huge overlap between online and distance education, can we meaningfully disentangle does online education work from does distance education work? Not a question this time, but an assertion. We have to distinguish between sustained, mature, online and distance education. We have to distinguish this from the products of what we may call the COVID-induced Great Leap Online. They're different beasts. And another assertion, another necessary distinction, this time between pure 100% online and distance education and the kind undertaken by the great majority of University of London distance education students. They also enroll with a recognised teaching centre and experienced in person as well as online education. CODE is starting a research project into the opening question, do online and distance education work? We therefore don't have much in the way of answers yet, although we may already have one answer, which I'll share with you later. Happily, the answer is yes. But we have questions and issues. We want to collect your initial answers and questions. Put your answers in the Padlet. Let's loop back. Do online and distance education work? What might we mean by work? Maybe we might mean that students progress and succeed at assessment. We, the investigators, should be able to get access to aggregated assessment results. We might mean that students find online and distance education rewarding, accessible, congenial, convenient, and having many other virtues. We should be able to access any student evaluation and feedback results. If we need more, we may be able to undertake some surveys. But throwing the question back to you, what else might we mean by work? It becomes increasingly tempting to ask, how well do online and distance education work in comparison to what used to be conventional face-to-face education? There are at least 2 difficulties here. Because of the varied pattern of higher education, with both differing and changing balances between in-person and online education, let alone distance education, it's very difficult to find an appropriate comparator for online and distance education. 100% in-person education is probably gone forever. Indeed, it probably never existed. Students have long spent half or more of their study time working alone or in groups in the library or the lab or the workshop or in their room, at any rate, away from the teacher. Bacradnia back in 2006 had some valuable data on this. There's another comparison problem. Many students do not face an even choice as between in-person, online, and distance education. Their circumstances, including but not limited to financial, geographical, and social, may push or pull them towards one or other particular form of education and may exclude other forms. The comparison with something inaccessible is not a sensible comparison. And that's a sense in which we may already have a yes to a research question. Online and distance education may work in the particular sense that they allow students who cannot attend in person face-to-face education to study successfully for a degree. That's a yes. There's another more fundamental reason I don't like using conventional in-person or face-to-face education as the comparator. It assumes that conventional in-person, face-to-face education in some unproblematic senses work. That's an assumption worth testing, but not for now. For the UK Office for Students, via section B3 of their current draft regulatory framework, work means works with respect to student continuation and completion. Of course, OFS have numbers for this. Degree outcomes, including differential outcomes for students with different characteristics, they sort of have numbers for this. Graduate employment, and in particular, progression to professional jobs and postgraduate study, and also there are numbers for this. We might also feel that ODE need to work in relation to other factors, including student satisfaction. We will need to work with the OFS account as it evolves, while recognizing the difficulties that it imposes for online and distance education. For example, we have to acknowledge, as to be fair to OFS, indeed perhaps celebrate the sometimes very different characteristics of ODE students with respect, for example, to age, employment status, family obligations, etc., which can impinge greatly on the 3 points listed above. I referred earlier to this unique advantage of online and distance education. We have to be strong and confident about that if we can find the data to back up. Do we have any data on differential student characteristics as between ODE and face-to-face study? Again, acknowledging that many students study at a recognised teaching centre, we'll try and find out. There are points of reference against which we can judge whether and to what extent higher education of whatever form works. The Quality Assurance Agency quality standards and subject benchmarks provide points of reference. These are necessarily subject to interpretation, but we should note that the QAA framework is ambitious. For example, as part of the description for a degree with honours, just listen to this, 4.15.1. Holders of a bachelor's degree with honours will have developed an understanding of a complex body of knowledge, some of it at the current boundaries of an academic discipline. That's good. Through this, the holder will have developed analytic techniques and problem-solving skills that can be applied in many types of employment. The holder of such a qualification will be able to evaluate evidence and arguments and assumptions to reach sound judgments and to communicate them effectively. How does this play out in practice? The next few are from a subject benchmark, geography, in fact. A geographical education develops a range of subject-specific skills, including spatial awareness and observation, recognizing the moral, ethical, and safety issues involved in all aspects of geographical inquiry, conducting fieldwork and data collection, assessing risks and their mitigation, employing a variety of interpretive methods, for example, participant observation, ethnographic interviews, and autoethnography, employing a variety of social survey methods, for example, questionnaire surveys and semi-structured interviews, employing a variety of science laboratory skills and methods, for example, soil, water, and sediment preparation and analysis. I won't read through all of them, but if we imagine these kinds of capabilities being applied at the kind of academic level suggested at least a few minutes ago, we have an account of what it would mean for a degree in geography to be working, certainly with respect to academic level and the QAA standards. Myriad problems remain, particularly around this concept of academic level. Again, there are approaches. Careful use of Bloom's venerable taxonomy staying at the upper levels of analysis and at the continuing interaction between evaluation and synthesis. Also using BIG's frankly underused but very valuable solo taxonomy, concentrating on more complex tasks and interactions. These can take us some way towards a usable account of academic level, but the problems of assessment remain, even with apparently high-level assessment tasks, unless we know how many and how similar prior tasks the students have undertaken and received feedback on. You can't tell what the actual assessment task is by looking at the assessment task alone. But we won't go into all of this now, because frustratingly, such data are not accessible to us. Assessment results remain the nearest proxy measures we have and are likely to have. Unless we can dive deep into examination papers, students' prior exposure to similar assessment tasks, student answers, marking schemes, marked student scripts, unmoderated and then moderated marks, the beating heart of assessment, of judgment, of living academic level, these remain inaccessible. So we'll probably have to make do with student results, with student feedback, and perhaps with surveys. Of course, does it work is actually a rather boring binary question. How well does it work? It's a slightly less boring, it's still uniscalar question. We really want to know how and in what ways online and distance education do and do not work, and for whom, and also why. These will be data we can use. If we can get them, you can see why we're going to need your help. We made a little progress on this in a thorough evaluation of the course that the centre ran in late 2021, early 2022 for 250 tutors at the Open University of China. They told us how satisfied they were with the course, average 90%, pretty good. They told us how the course could be improved. We'll make many of these changes for next time. They told us what they'd learned from the course. This was fascinating and very encouraging. They told us how they planned to use what they learned from the course. 87% had definite plans to use what they learned. This was very encouraging. Later, they told us how they had already used what they learned from the course. 89% had already made some use of what they learned. This is encouraging too. Look, this was an easier evaluation to carry out than the kind we're talking about for degrees. A course of only a few months duration, highly vocational, and we had direct access to the students. Recently published work by myself and Stephen Brown offered another angle on how does online and distance education work. In summary, we found a mismatch between staff and student views on what are useful elements of online and distance education. More precisely, we found a mismatch between the research on student learning and student views on useful elements of ODE. The title of the paper reveals the main finding. The title is Not Another Group Activity: Student Attitudes to Individual and Collaborative Learning Activities, and Some Implications for Distance Learning, Course Design and Operation. You might find it useful to at least scan the paper. Of course, we'd love to know how and how well ODE courses work for individual students. But we typically don't ask individual students why they're studying, so this remains unknowable. We assume they want to pass and get a good or better job in their current or intended field of study, but they might be studying for some other reason completely. It's really tough to judge whether something works or not, unless you know what the people using it want from it. But we're probably going to have to go with assumptions on this one. What would you like to know about how well and how online and distance education work? How else can we find out? Have we got the right questions? What do you already know about this? Please talk to us. I'm David at davidbaume.com, and thank you.